Welcome, everybody, through to the Leading Through Crisis webinar on the human experience of COVID-19. We're really pleased that you could join us here today. My name is Daniel Ames. I'm a professor at Columbia Business School in the Management Division. I'm a social and personality psychologist by training. I've been at Columbia for about 20 years, taught in the leadership core, and now lead our curriculum on managerial negotiations, one of the most popular electives at the business school. And I'm really pleased to be here with you today and with my colleague, Sandra Matz. Sandra, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm also super excited about the session, kind of chatting through some of the research that we've been doing in the context of COVID. A little bit on my background. I joined, it's like I'm heading into my fourth year now, like time flies. Also social and personality psychologist by training, kind of intersection of computer science and psychology, business, so trying to understand what people are up to in their daily lives by looking at some of the traces that they leave online.
Fantastic. So, so we're both psychologists by training, and we're really interested in human behavior and the human experience, and the human experience in this moment, in the midst of this pandemic. You know, it's interesting on its own. I mean, this is, hopefully a once-in-a-lifetime event for us. But it's also a window onto human psychology, human behavior, human sense-making, how we thrive, what leads to well-being and what interferes with that, how we read and misread the people around us, and how we collaborate and work with one another. We're going to talk through a number of topics today. So Sandra and I, when we're not in the classroom, we're active social science researchers, and we've been working on a lot of projects, some of which are relevant to this context. And we're going to talk through a few of those things today from a research point of view, tell you some of what we're seeing in our work. And then at the end, we hope we'll have some time to open it up for discussion, and we'd love to hear some of your view, maybe your reaction or questions about what we've done, but also your description of what's happening in your world. One of the themes in our work, in my work and Sandra's work, is that different people are having different experiences, sometimes because of different beliefs they have, beliefs about human nature, really fundamental beliefs. Sometimes differences in their personalities. Some people are more extroverted or introverted, or agreeable or maybe less agreeable. And also the circumstances surrounding them, the countries that they live in. The space that they're surrounded by as maybe they're sheltering at home. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about my research on trust, some of the work I've been doing on trust in this context, and then turn to a little bit of some of the research I've been doing on interpersonal conflict. Along the way, Sandra will be jumping in with questions and to correct me if I'm wrong about things or when I'm wrong about things, maybe adding some of her own observations. So Sandra, jump in at any point. And then we'll shift and talk about Sandra's work, some of Sandra's recent research. She has a fascinating sort of big data perspective on things, and thinking especially about well-being and mental health in this context, how it's unfolding over time and in different places, different countries, and how that's sort of bound up with social distancing. So what's the impact of social distancing on us? And again, different people are having really different experiences with this. And so I'm really excited to hear more about some of her research and engage in a little bit of a conversation on that. So with that preface said, that roadmap in place, let's turn to some of the work I've been doing on trust. And I'm going to see if I can share my screen to talk a little bit about some of what I've been doing. So this is taking a step back. Kind of a step back from our daily experience, a step back from the pandemic itself, and thinking about a really very, very basic social question. Do you trust the people around you? Do you feel like you can rely on them? Are you willing to be vulnerable to them? That's a question we confront very early in our lives with our caregivers. And we sort of develop, kind of different points of view about this. We start to figure out if we can attach securely to our caregivers, or maybe they're unreliable. And as we grow, we start to develop a point of view about trust, about our family, our peers, eventually about politicians and business leaders, even about scientists and business professors. And it was interesting, Sandra, as I was reading some of the literature on this, to discover that scientists are highly trusted, maybe especially right now, highly trusted, more so than university professors. So I think we'll identify as scientists today more so than business professors, right? Business school professors. But so we have different trusts for different sorts of kind of targets. But what I'm interested in, and that kind of varies, but what I'm interested in is what's sometimes called generalized trust. What's your basic model for human beings? Sort of what's your world view? Do you feel like people, in general, human beings, can be trusted? And some people think, yeah, you kind of can't be too careful. Other people think most people can be trusted. And that, to me, is such a fascinating difference between us, this belief, this worldview of generalized trust. And each of us kind of comes from a different point on that.
And maybe if I can jump in for a second, where does it come from? So you're saying that there's individual differences in terms of how we generally trust other people, potentially something that's in our nature, in our character. Where does it come from? How do we get there?
Yeah, it's a great question, you know, and as a parent, I've wondered, is it heritable, right? Is your view on trust, like, do you pass it along to your offspring? It turns out the evidence on heritability is somewhere between mixed and utterly absent, that this isn't, unlike a lot of individual differences or traits or ideologies, some of which are highly heritable. Trust doesn't necessarily seem to kind of be passed down from one generation to the next. Research suggests a lot of it has to do with our own personal life experiences, especially early life experiences. And some negative ones can have a big effect on our trust, being the victim of crime, being mistreated by authorities. Some research suggests being laid off by an employer can have a profound effect on your trust. And so our own life experience affects it, as well as the experience of the people that we're close to. And the media affects our sense of trust as well. One thing I've seen in my own evidence is people who are heavy social media users tend to have lower generalized trust. So this is a fascinating dimension to me. So, you know, and it shapes all kinds of things. It shapes our well-being. It shapes our relationships. Yeah, go ahead, Sandra.
No, like just talking, because you mentioned life events. So you talked about being laid off. Obviously, a major life event that we're going through right now is the pandemic. Maybe can you just say a little bit more about how trust is being shaped by the pandemic, potentially for different people differently?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting. So this has been a topic of study for years. I'm putting up a slide here that shows the trajectory of trust in the United States, and the thick line is sort of trust in people in general. And you kind of see there's a trajectory. It kind of goes up and down a little bit, but it has not been on a positive trend for the last few decades. It's been going down, and now kind of at the end of that chart, yes, this is this special moment, the pandemic. So this is a novel situation, and I think people are using this as a chance to kind of figure out the situation, and they're looking at each other and trying to figure out, let's take stock of what other people are like. And to me, that leads to a couple big questions. This moment of like trust in the context of this pandemic. We came into this pandemic with a starting point about trust, generalized trust. Does it stick or does it shift? And this, to me, is a fascinating question. Are people rewriting their views of trust for each other in this context, this big moment? Or do we kind of stick with what we already had? And the second question to me that's fascinating as well is like, are we getting it right? Is our belief, our kind of trust beliefs about each other, are they kind of in line? The behavior we expect, is that in line with what we're getting? And to me, these are fascinating questions. I've been trying to do a little bit of research on these questions. Let me start with the second one, because I actually think the answer to that kind of comes back around to the first one. So on the one hand, you'd think, look, we'd get this right because we're getting a lot of feedback and evidence from the world telling us if we're trusting people in the wrong place. That we'd over time kind of tune to get it right. But a long tradition of work suggests that on balance, we often get this wrong. That our trust judgments, that we often err on the side of cynicism. And there's a fascinating tradition of work, even in the context of emergencies and crises. Sometimes they're called disaster myths, that people tend to expect the worst out of people in the context of a disaster. So sometimes one disaster myth is that people are going to freak out and run away, like in the context of an earthquake or a fire or a tornado or something. People will just freak out, have a meltdown, and run away. or that there's going to be a lot of looting. The social order will break down and people will just turn to crime and antisocial behavior, or that people will be paralyzed. They'll just be in a stupor and they won't know what to do. And research on crises, not necessarily a pandemic, but in crises in general, suggests these myths are myths, that people actually tend to remain relatively calm, spring into action, help one another, organize for support in their community. So there's a larger set of, I think, findings that suggest maybe we're too cynical in terms of what we expect in a bad situation. And I've studied some of this in the context of the pandemic. And I'll see if I can get some of this up here. I've asked people, so this is early on in the pandemic. Now we're talking about like March or April. I asked people, do you expect to help or share your neighbors and people in your community if they need it? And the white line is people's own responses. And 80+% of people said, yes, I will do that. The blue line in there is people's expectations for other people. And they thought maybe 60% of people would step up and do this. I asked, would you support policies, like greater good policies, things that would be good for the country and the community, even if it meant some inconvenience for you? Again, 80+% or 80 or so percent of people said, I would do this, but they expected far fewer of their neighbors. I also had to ask in the midst of the pandemic, so this I think was in April, about toilet paper, and ask people, you know, if you went to the grocery store, and this is when toilet paper was hard to find, but if you went to the grocery store and you happened to find some toilet paper, what would you do? And what do you think most people would do? And about 5% of people said, I would buy all the toilet paper. But people expected something like half of other people would take all the toilet paper that was available. So people are, were kind of a little cynical in what they expected from people. They didn't expect as much good stuff, and they expected lots of antisocial behavior, hoarding behavior. And all of those things were linked to their views of generalized trust. So that to me is kind of, are we getting our trust judgments right? I think there's reasons to think we're erring on the side of cynicism.
Okay, so we're all to some extent better than everybody else, like by judging ourselves and potentially not as trusting as we should be if we think about society at large. So you've covered the second part of the question. I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about the whether people actually change, because you came in saying that there's this general level of trust, but then also if you think about, okay, pandemic, no pandemic, like does that potentially change over time?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I think you're right. Like we don't give ourselves enough credit in a sense, in general, right? Not all of us are angels and not all of us are cynics, but in general, we're not giving ourselves enough credit. But so then let's go back to that question of like, well, okay, if we expect the worst and we're getting something slightly better than the worst from each other, do we update? Do we change our minds? Do our defaults stick, or do we learn? Do we change? And my interpretation is, I'm simplifying a lot of things, it's really, really sticky. It's really, really sticky. That trust levels, I found, have been incredibly consistent over time. That people really haven't shifted much in their global views of trustworthy. And we've looked at a few things in here. People's trust before the pandemic, as they were coming in, affects or sort of predicts what behavior they observe, the balance of behavior they see, people doing good things or bad things. People who came in trusting said, I'm seeing lots of good behavior. People who came in with low trust said, I'm seeing lots of antisocial behavior. We asked people to report on an event that they thought was noteworthy. Just anything they wanted. What do you want to observe? And some people talked about people helping other people. Some people talked about people ripping off or price gouging. And people came in with high trust. The noteworthy events they called out were these positive things. People came in with low trust. The events they called out were these negative things. We even asked about surprises. So in one of the surveys in May, we asked people, what's a surprising thing that's happened? Now, you would think if you had a belief about the world, the thing that would be surprising to you is something other than that belief. But it turns out that's not exactly what we found with trust. People who came in with high trust said the thing that surprised me was how amazingly trustworthy people were, like these wonderful positive behaviors. People who came in with low trust were more likely to say, I was actually surprised by how untrustworthy people were. So it's sort of like they're confirming their beliefs, but saying they're surprised at how right they were. And so we see this real kind of stickiness, which I interpret as a lot of a confirmation bias, that we go into the world with a hunch and we see what we expect to see, And I think a bunch of that is what's going on with trust. And so I guess I would say, for me, one of the upshots of all of this is the trust that you can tap into a crisis is largely the trust that you had heading into a crisis. That people have this amazing ability to assimilate that experience to what they came in with a view of high trust. They interpret it through that lens and they see that. People with low trust, they interpret a situation through that lens and they see that as what's playing out. So I think that's probably all I should say about trust for now, unless we get into a larger discussion about this. But I know you have some things about trust, and I want to get to what you have to say about that too.
No, I'm going to touch on trust a little bit later on. And I think it's this fascinating topic where it really shows that, well, it depends on who you are. It to some extent depends on the situation, but like who you are potentially kind of overrides and whatever you see in other people, even if it's in the context of a pandemic. Mm-hmm. Now, like we've talked about trust, and this is like this positive side of, okay, I can trust the people around me. Like if you think about the flip side, I know that you've also done a bunch of work on conflict. So if trust breaks down, people potentially engage in behaviors that we don't necessarily want to see. Can you just say a little bit more about that, maybe related to the context of the pandemic?
Yeah, so conflict. So I've been fascinated by conflict, about, just kind of like how people disagree and how they work through their disagreements and what's happening to that in the context of this crisis, that, people are under stress, they're working from home, they're quarantined with people they love, or maybe people that they don't entirely love, or they have pets, or they don't have pets, whatever it is, right? And I'm fascinated to see, like, how's all this affecting conflict. Now, you could imagine it making it worse, that we're all kind of stressed out and sort of cooped up in our homes. You can also imagine it making it better, that maybe, we're able to get away from the office, to get away from, that guy in the office who could be a real stressor, who's a toxic person, who's a real kind of trigger for us. So maybe there's like this actual upside. So we've looked into this in some of our surveys, and people's experience varies. But on average, earlier in the summer, again, this was around May, people told us, if anything, their experience with conflict was getting slightly better. And honestly, I found that kind of surprising. So, okay. And it turned out one personality dimension. So there are lots of ways of talking about personality. One common model is sometimes called the Big Five. It's these 5 dimensions of personality. And Sandra is an expert in the Big Five perspective on personality. And one of the Big Five turned out to actually shed some light on or tell us something about people's experience with conflict. Sandra, can you guess which of the Big Five that might be?
I'm assuming it's agreeableness.
It is agreeableness. And you said that very agreeably, right? Like, so, yes. So agreeableness is sort of like the warmth and sort of almost sympathy and sort of social generosity we bring to others. People who are lower on this dimension of agreeableness are sometimes maybe seen as colder or more quarrelsome or more critical. And so there's a lot of ways that humans can be on this dimension, but it turns out agreeable people said that they were having a better time. Or you could look at it the reverse way. Disagreeable people said their conflicts weren't going as well. So, okay, so this was May, and we thought, well, that now looking back, at the time we thought, well, this is just about over. But of course, looking back, it was like, buckle up. That was just the opening chapter. Now, here we are in August, right? And over the last few weeks, we decided, let's go back and check in with people again. Maybe now the fun is gone and conflicts are getting worse. And so we asked people about this, and it turns out it was much the same. That on balance, people said conflict's about the same for me, but more people said it's actually getting better than getting worse. And we saw that as much in the workplace, with workplace conflict, as with personal conflict. So maybe it is good to escape some of our less pleasant colleagues, right? That we can be home. And in fact, when we look at factors, when we asked people who said conflict is better at work for me now, my workplace conflict is better. We asked them about factors, about why. And one of the leading factors they singled out for why conflict is better in the workplace is less contact with colleagues. They didn't name names, but they said less contact with colleagues. So I thought that was fascinating. But again, we're seeing some effects of personality. Agreeableness is predicting some of people's experience. So agreeable people say they're having a better time. Less agreeable people say they're having a little bit of a worse time. And let me just say one more thing briefly about this, and then I want to wrap up about conflict and get on to some of your research, Sandra. We're seeing this interesting difference between kind of self and other, and it interacts with agreeableness. So when we ask people, what's this pandemic doing to you in terms of conflict? Is it bringing out the best in your conflict behavior or bringing out the worst in your conflict behavior? People say overwhelmingly, it's doing great, right? Like this is really, there's stress, but it's bringing out the best in me in terms of conflict. We said, what about the people around you? Is it bringing out the best or the worst in them? And you can see that it's a different pattern, right? This conflict, I'm thriving, but everybody else, they're getting worse at conflict. Now, what's interesting to me is when you interact this with agreeableness, you see a pretty different pattern. People who are highly agreeable overwhelmingly said, this is bringing out the best in me. And what's interesting to me is they were generous in their perceptions of others. They also said, it's bringing out the best in the people around me. People who are lower in agreeableness, they were less likely to say it's bringing out the best in them, and they were more likely to say it's bringing out the worst in the people around them. And to me, what's fascinating is this isn't based on the disagreeableness of the people around you. This is based on the respondent's own disagreeableness. And to me, what's fascinating is that I think part of what's happening here is people who are lower in agreeableness are eliciting certain reactions from the people around them. They're ascribing those reactions to those people rather than seeing themselves as a trigger, as the situation that may evoke some of that behavior. So to me, this is a fascinating story. I'm going to keep tracking this about conflict and personality in the pandemic. If there's another question you have, Sandra, I'm happy to hear it, but I would love to get some of your research.
Yeah, no, I think it's super fascinating. I just have I was coming out of, and you noticed, I was just come out of teaching and negotiations block week. And one of the really interesting things that we saw, and I think to some extent it speaks to your work on agreeableness here, is that it seemed to have been much harder to create trust with the other side, to create this positive rapport, to create a positive relationship with other people over Zoom. So I think it's really this idea that, well, maybe we're feeling somewhat better because we don't see the colleagues, which is a sad truth, to be honest. If that's the case, maybe you want to change jobs. But the idea that we just have to work harder to make it work over Zoom. And I could see how agreeable people are just putting in this extra effort and going this extra mile to make sure that they create this positive rapport. But I think this is for me, extremely interesting to see how this really changed over Zoom, because nothing else changed in the way that people negotiated, but they found it harder to build this rapport over time.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Now, you have been doing some fascinating work on mood and mood over time and mood in different places. So I don't know if that's the place that you want to start, but I'd love to hear about some of the research that you've been doing in this context.
I'm gonna share I think you'll have to stop sharing your slides, then I can.
There we go.
And I can start. Thanks for handing over. I assume you can all see the slides. Yeah, so I'm really kind of excited to present some of this work because it's fresh out of the press, so to say. It's not published yet. It's work that I've been doing with some of my students, and it's really, as Daniel was saying earlier, it's really kind of trying to see what are people's experiences with the pandemic. And we oftentimes hear about what is the toll on our physical health. So we kind of talk about how many people die and how many people get hospitalized, what are the symptoms, and so on and so forth. But there's also been this proposition that COVID actually has potentially has a pretty negative impact on our mental health, right? And there's a couple of reasons for why this is likely the case. For some side effects of COVID, it's unemployment, uncertainty, the feeling of helplessness, we're losing control over what's happening in our lives. All of these things have been related to lower and poorer mental health and lower levels of well-being before. So like one of the things that we were interested in is to see how does it really impact mental health? Because we're not really, we have an idea that it might be predictive, but there's very little empirical data to support the claim. So we were kind of trying to see what's actually happening again in people's daily lives. And what we did for this purpose, let me just see if I can click the next slide. Okay, so what we did is we collaborated with this app, like it's a German startup, it's called Moodpath, and it allows people to track their well-being, their mental health over time. So this app has been around for a couple of years. It's available in the Google Play Store, in the Android store. And what it does, like once you've downloaded it, it just pings you 3 times a day to respond to short questionnaires, like something like, have you lately been thinking about the same topic without coming to a solution, like a whole range of questions. And what's happening in the background is that it assesses your daily mood. So every day it asks you, how do you currently feel? What's your current mood? And then over the period of 2 weeks, it generates a depression assessment. So again, it asks you all of these questions, and then it to some extent tries to determine whether you might be going through a depressive episode right now or not. And what's really nice about this data, and this is why, like, one of the reasons why I love to work with big data, is that you can go back in time, right? This data has been collected for the past couple of years. It's been sitting on the server of Moodpath, and we can actually almost like going back in time, back into the past, and see how has mood, how has depression changed over the course of time. So in this case, we're focused on, just because that's where we had enough data, we looked at the UK, the US, and Germany for 2019 and 2020. And I think that's really one of the very interesting aspects of this work, is that we can see what is happening in the pandemic, and I'm going to show you what these graphs look like in a second, but we can also say, okay, so this is what we see right now, but how does that compare to 2019, right? So maybe in the springtime, everybody's getting happy and everybody's getting less depressed. So how, like, are we deviating from what we would typically see right now? It's a huge data set, which means that we just have a lot of confidence in the results that we see. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is just some of the trajectories that are based on the data. So this is mood trajectories for the US. It starts in 2019 and then goes all the way to June 2020. You can see there's like these spikes for the winter break or Christmas and then Thanksgiving. So people are kind of happy when these things happen, and they're like pretty pronounced, as you can see. And the red, I'm not sure if this works here. Like here, if this red line is the onset of COVID-19, and you can see that the cases plotted in this blue shape in the bottom right corner. And what you see, at least in the US, and we're going to compare this in just a second to Germany, is you do see like a little dip, right? So this is mood. Lowest scores are to some extent kind of indicating lower levels of mood. So you do see this initial dip, but you can also see that it recovers really quickly. So it's not that the pandemic hits, people's levels of mood drop, and then they just stay low. There's like an initial drop, but then people recover extremely quickly, which to some extent is a good sign. Now this is when what I said earlier becomes important. Like if you compare this to 2019, you do see that we don't get this boost in positive mood that we typically see over the course of spring, right? So we kind of come out of the winter break, the weather's terrible, we're all miserable, and then we have like the first few beautiful days of spring, and people are like, oh my God, this is great, life is so good. And you see that in this case, the onset of the pandemic actually to some extent suppressed this positive increase in mood. Now, you also see, so those are the depression trajectories plotted again for the US over the course of 2019 and 2020. And you see relatively similar patterns here. So in this case, higher scores are actually poorer mental health because it's depression. And you can see the pandemic hits, and there's like a slight increase in the first couple of weeks, but it levels out relatively quickly. But what you also see is that when you compare it to 2019, again, we're not seeing this typical drop in depression when springtime hits. So to some extent, like when I first saw these, to be honest, like when I first saw these results, my expectation was actually that mood was going to drop dramatically and like depression was going to increase dramatically just because the circumstances of the pandemic. So to some extent, I was actually kind of quite positively surprised that people seem to be incredibly resilient, right? At least on average. So we're going to come back to this notion of, well, not everybody is doing well in the pandemic, and what are some of the characteristics of people who might be struggling more than others. But at least on average, it seems that people are coping relatively well. And what I think is potentially even more interesting is that this, to some extent, varies across countries, right? So this is the US. I can tell you the UK looks very similar, just has like somewhat lower levels of mood and higher levels of depressions across the board. Having lived in the UK, I can attest that it's really difficult to live in rain all the time. But the patterns look pretty similar across the UK and the US. And the one exception that we see in this data is Germany. So if you look at Germany, what you see is, again, like if we're focusing on the onset of the pandemic, like this is mood. So again, like what we had expected was the pandemic hits and mood drops. And we see the exact opposite, right? So the pandemic hits and mood keeps going up. So there's not even like in the US that there's like this initial dip and it recovers quickly. There's essentially no response to the pandemic in Germany. And it's the same in 2019. So we just see this overall positive trend over the course of spring. You also see that for depression, where the drop is almost like even more impressive, right? So like there's depression is somewhat medium, and then the pandemic hits and it actually drops relatively rapidly. So almost the opposite of what we had been expecting is that in Germany, it seems to be the case that the pandemic hits. It's not necessarily having a super positive effect because we would expect this trend over time and over the course of the spring. But it's clearly the case that in 2020, the results, like in terms of depression and mood, didn't look any different to the results in 2019. So really highlighting, and for me, this highlights both the fact that people are incredibly resilient. So maybe there's like some initial struggles of adapting to the new reality, but people really kind of habituate really quickly and then say, okay, here's how we can make the most of the situation that we're in.
So Sandra, that's fascinating, that especially the point about kind of resiliency, because you would sort of expect everything would just kind of go off a cliff and it would be terrible. But you found these really intriguing differences between the US and Germany. If there's more you want to unpack about that, I want to hear it, but it leads me to a question of why. Do you have any guesses why you might be seeing some of that difference?
And I think this is super interesting. So I grew up in Germany. I'm German. I lived there for most of my life. And I think like it's based on my experience from everything that I hear about my friends. And you can also see that reflected in the media, right? So the media about like how Germany contained the virus, it was like a very coordinated response by the government. It was very clear from the get-go. We're in a crisis. We're acknowledging this. And here's how we can actually get out of this crisis. So some of it have attributed this to Angela Merkel being a scientist. But I think coming back to your part of the conversation, I think a lot of it has to do with trust, right? So you can, in Germany, the way that I've seen this play out with my parents and with my friends is like, okay, we're in a difficult situation. We all acknowledge this. We know that our leaders acknowledging this situation that we're in, and we have the trust in our government to do the right thing, to put regulations in place that are going to help all of us. So I think this element of trust in the government, doing the right thing, kind of understanding what's happening, is something that I saw happening a lot more in Germany than I saw happening in the UK, where there was absolutely no initial response. And there was like, okay, there's a lockdown from today to tomorrow. And it's also, I didn't see that happening in the US as much, right? So I just recently saw this article, which I thought was shocking, is that Americans die of COVID-19 over 7 times more frequently than people in Europe and Canada, controlling for population size. And it's this idea that we're to some extent losing trust in our leaders because they're this back and forth. It's very political, it's very politicized. It's not necessarily what's the best way forward for our country, but mostly what is the best way forward potentially for our party. And you see that reflected in the case rates, and you see that reflected, I think, in people's well-being response to the crisis.
So where do you go from where does this take you in your thinking and in your research? So I think that's absolutely sensible interpretation of the situation. You know, some of this is also manifesting in things like social distancing, things like sheltering at home. Do you see that as part of the difference as well?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think to some extent, and this is also coming back what you were saying earlier, right? So the way that we feel our experiences, our behavior, to some extent is determined by the context that we're in. So whether I'm in Germany or in the US, whether our leaders are actually taking responsibility has most likely an impact on how I feel personally. But there's also factors that are much more immediate to how am I spending, what is the context of the pandemic that I'm in? What are my own personal characteristics? And some of the work that I've done specifically has looked at the impact of social distancing, as you mentioned. So that's a reality that all of us have gone through to various degrees. But it's really interesting to see how is something that has been mandated in most countries around the world, how is that impacting people's mental health? And the idea is like, well, maybe it's not that, like, not all experiences are created equal, right? So sometimes we have to shelter in place, sometimes we don't. And then even if we shelter in place, we might not all cope with this to the same extent. And like what I've been interested in particular is this idea of, well, like what is it that social distancing actually changes? And I've done some prior work on like how the places that we spend time in impacts mental health. So we all make choices about where to spend our time every day. We kind of spend time at home, like in a coffee shop. We go to work. As you said, like we have to be exposed to our grumpy colleagues. And all of these kind of places and the people in those places to some extent shape our well-being and mental health. And there's this framework that I really like from a sociologist who said there's actually three big categories of places. Like the first place, as he calls it, is home. So we all have this reference point home that we come back to in the evening. Then there's work, which is the second place that we go to, not right now, but typically. And then the third places, which are all the places that are social. It's like public life where people get together to spend time, share perspectives, and so on and so forth. And what we know about how these places relate to well-being is essentially like the social places, not super surprisingly, seem to be the places that have the biggest positive impact on mental health, right? So if you connect with other people, you have this feeling of, oh, there's actually like a shared reality and I can relate to someone and I can get social advice and so on and so forth. So those seem to be the most important one in a positive way. Home is to some extent this neutral space that we can come back to. It's like a sanctuary where we can re-energize. And then work, kind of coming back to your example with the grumpy colleagues, is the place that is most anxiety inducing and most stressful when you compare it to the other places. What I think is interesting in the context of the pandemic is that like social distancing has actually changed the way that we interact with our environment, right? So to some extent, like the social places disappear mostly. Now we're slowly, gradually opening back up, but our experience of social places still is pretty different. It's not this kind of flow of like people talking to each other and so on and so forth. So the positive side to some extent disappears. And what's also happening is that like the home and work are no longer separate. So we kind of have to work from home depending on how we manage this. But it's like, it means that some of these potentially negative feelings about work, like stress, anxiety, now leak into our personal lives. And we no longer have this sanctuary that is home where we can come back to and say, okay, forget about work. Let's leave work at the office. I'm now in my kind of personal space and I'm going to kind of re-energize. So those are all, I think, just like ways in which we can think about, okay, like how is social distancing most likely impacting mental health, right? If you look at all of these things, like our expectation would be like when people social distance, they probably have struggled more to maintain positive well-being.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Oh, so you have more.
No, you go
show
ahead.
Us more, please.
I'm just going to run through like a high-speed tour, but if you have like questions, like feel free to jump in at any point in time. Otherwise, I'm just going to
go
browse through. So those were the expectations that we went in with, like assuming that social distancing to some extent is detrimental to people's health, mental health and well-being. And this is also what we see. So in this case, and what we look at here is a within person analysis. So we're essentially saying we ask people multiple times, are you currently social distancing or not? And then we see, okay, like in the moments when people social distance, what is their mood like? What does their depression look like? In moments where they don't, what does their mood look like, and so on and so forth. So you can see in this case, this is mood again, so higher scores are an indicator of better mental health. So when people are not social distancing, they seem to be doing better. So the idea that social distancing takes a toll on our mental health seems to be playing out, at least on average. And here's, I think, where this interesting notion of not all experiences are created equal comes in. Because if someone says yes or answers yes to the question of are you social distancing, we also ask them, what is your experience of that? And so we asked them, how burdensome do you perceive social distancing to be? And in this case, 1 is not at all. So people don't struggle with social distancing, and 4 is extremely. So it's like an extreme burden on my life and mental well-being. And you can see that it's like this function of what is people's subjective experience of social distancing? So people on the far right, the people who say it's extremely burdensome, they experience much, much lower levels of mental health, and in this case, mood. But what you also see, and I think this is fascinating, if you look at the dark blue bar on the left, like the people who say, I'm social distancing, but it's actually not at all a burden, they to some extent even do better than people who are not social distancing. Or when they're like, in this case, they do better than themselves when they're not social distancing. So this idea that for some people, the pandemic and social distancing might have actually been a blessing, right? So in my case, for example, my partner lives in Chicago. We barely ever see each other because we're traveling when we have to teach and so on. So for us, actually, social distancing meant that we got to spend more time together. I know that a lot of people are like, well, this is the first time in years that we've all had dinner together as a family, pretty much every single day. So it really kind of depends on, it's not that social distancing per se is a challenge for mental health, but it really depends on how people live through this experience. And it's the same for depression, in this case, obviously the opposite, where lower scores are better. So people are on average more depressed or have a higher likelihood of being depressed when they're social distancing. But again, these huge differences in terms of how people actually experience social distancing.
That's fascinating that, there is a general effect, but it really varies. So for some people, it's not a burden, it's a blessing. Like, when you can be home with your dog, right, all day long and enjoy cuddle times with your dog, which you don't ordinarily get at the office, that can be a happy thing. So I'm curious, like, do you have any speculations about, so what are some of the things that go into making it a burden versus a blessing? And you've already foreshadowed some of this.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting question. And right now we can only speculate. So we don't have any insights because all we know about these people is how are they doing? Do they consider it burdensome or not? But I do think that there's like a few general indicators from what we see in the media, from like anecdotal evidence. And to some extent, I think some of it is sociodemographics, right? So we know that women, for example, are most likely the ones looking after the children, or like a lot more often looking after the children. And if it's like homeschooling, there's only so much you can pack into a day. If you have to homeschool your kid and you're also supposed to work, and then you're also supposed to kind of take care of everything else. So kind of thinking about like what has changed, like what are now the responsibilities of different people? And there's a bunch of kind of initial evidence that it seems to be impacting women a lot more than men. And then coming back to your personality traits, right? So if we think about like people have different experiences, they have different preferences for socializing. Extroversion is the trait that is typically associated with people loving social interaction, seeking out social interaction, seeking out this excitement in larger groups. So it might be the case that kind of staying at home, not necessarily seeing other people, is a lot harder for those people who typically love to do that. So personality could be another factor. And like some realities also, that's like, I think for some people, actually like essential workers, maybe staying at home has like an entirely different meaning, right? So in this case, it's like this uncertainty, maybe I would actually like to stay home, but I have to go and I have to do my job. Otherwise I'm potentially going to lose it. So then like it almost has this like this reversed meaning of, staying at home would be extremely desirable, but I can't do it. And this uncertainty and this feeling of I don't have control, I think is a large contributor to people feeling kind of or developing depressive symptoms or feeling that their lives are not going the way that they want to. So like we're hopefully going to learn a lot more about like who are the people that are mostly burdened by this experience.
Right. Oh, that's great. And we should, in a moment, we're going to start looking at some of the questions in the Q&A panel. So if you have questions, if you're watching and you're live and you have questions, you can post them there, and we're going to do our best with the time remaining to catch some of those. One thing I'll just call out, Sandra, that kind of dovetails with what you were just saying is some of our recent survey work. So we asked people a couple of questions about their well-being and a couple of questions as well about their sort of immediate physical space and situation. And we found a couple things that really correlated highly with stress and frustration and happiness and things like this. One is basically, do you have your own space where you can do what you like? And people who said they had that tended to be doing much better. You can imagine people who don't have that, not so happy. Can you find peace and quiet in your space? And for some people, there is no peace and quiet. And for others, I think they can find it. Now, that's one where I would also guess maybe introverts would be especially affected by being able to find some peace and quiet where they can kind of recharge, whereas extroverts may thrive on energy and noise. And we asked a third question, it's like, do you have access to nature? Do you have access to outdoor spaces where you can walk and play and things like this? And that was really predictive of people's reported well-being as well. So I think it kind of dovetails with the things that you were just mentioning.
And I think it's super interesting. And to some extent, it also ties into like one of the points that I wanted to make next, which is because you said like, okay, do I have my personal space, right? Can I find peace and quiet? And you kind of see all these articles all over the media is like, oh, we're never going to go back to the office. Like Google and Facebook already decided that their employees can stay home until 2021 and Twitter like indefinitely. So this idea of like maybe the office is dead and we're not going to return. And to some extent, I think the idea of giving people the choice to work from home is amazing because we know that it reduces stress if you don't have to commute and so on and so forth. But actually shutting down offices entirely, I think is a huge problem because like some of us are privileged, right? Like we have a second room where we can say, okay, we're going to set up the office and we're going to to some extent separate private from like our work life. And we can find a peace and quiet that we need like in this sanctuary. But others don't have this option. So kind of taking away the space that you can go to, be productive, and then leave all of your stress and all of your anxiety and all of your worries in that workplace and come home, I think would be like a really big challenge for people who who are not lucky enough to have enough space and that they can create for their office work. And then before we dive into the Q&A, because I'm also super excited to get the question, since I have everybody's ear, like one of the things that I think is really like important for me, and I hope that is also like, it just creates this conversation, is that like we're now all focused on like how many people died due to COVID-19. And maybe we think about, okay, what are the implications on mental health? But one of the things that I want to highlight is that number 10 in the most frequent causes of death is still suicide. So we're talking about mental health now in the context of the pandemic, but it's like a much bigger issue, right? It's a much bigger issue that it's not just limited to the US. You see the same pattern across the world, and it's actually rising. So suicide rates have been continuously growing over the past couple of years. And I think it's really a topic that we just all need to engage more regardless of COVID, because it is really taking lives, and it's not just doing so now, but it's doing it no matter what. So just my last call for action. And then with that, I'm gonna stop here and stop sharing, and we can move on to questions. But thanks for the questions.
Yeah. That was great, and a very important point to make there as well, Sandra. So we've gotten a number of questions, and I'm going to try to look at these, and Sandra is going to look at these. We're both going to sort of multitask and scan through what our participants have posed to us. At a quick glance I just had through there, a number of questions people were asking about various demographics, and I can tell you I'm still in the really early stages of analyzing some of my data, but absolutely want to try to understand and unpack demographics like sort of socioeconomics, race, gender, even occupation or region. So a number of these things, you're calling out some great questions, and I don't yet have answers to those things, but it's on my agenda to try to better understand in my own results. I don't know if there are any demographic moderators or effects that you want to call out that you've seen in your analyses to date, Sandra?
Sorry, I was just reading the questions.
That's all right.
Here you go.
And some people were asking too about like kind of like first responders, that they have a very different experience, that by, these kind of essential workers in some cases, in many cases, have no choice but have to go. And now there's a potentially even greater level of stress for them coming home, where it's not just work is work and then home is a refuge, but at work, you are almost by definition at risk, and then coming home, you're potentially bringing some of that risk home to your loved ones. And I don't have data on that, but I am absolutely sure that would be a stressful experience.
Yeah, there's all these anecdotes of like people sleeping in cars and having so I think it's really this idea that, like home is no longer the sanctuary, whether that's because it's like mixed up with work or because you're an essential worker working in a hospital and you're just worried of bringing it home. I think it's a really important point.
A couple of people, I saw some questions in here about what are the big five and how do you measure agreeableness. So I'll say this in brief, and Sandra can correct me because I think she knows this better than I do. But so the big five are 5 dimensions of personality, ways in which sort of normal, everyday humans vary. And a century of work has revolved around trying to understand what are the important, meaningful ways in which people vary. And there's lots of ways of looking at this. Some of this has actually come out of ways in which people describe one another, the sort of things that we notice about each other. When you tell somebody, what is he or she like? And you give a description, what do you include in that? And so that's one of the sources for this framework of the big five. So it includes agreeableness, sort of how warm or cold or critical and quarrelsome people are. Extroversion, so how energized, effusive, sort of talkative people might be. Conscientiousness, so how sort of disciplined, focused, organized somebody might be. Emotional stability, whether you're kind of excitable and volatile or relatively calm. And I don't know what I missed in there. Agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness, emotional stability. And extroversion. Okay, I think I covered all 5.
I think you covered all.
Okay, all right. And somebody asked how you measure agreeableness. And there's lots of ways to measure these things. Sometimes you might say, we have blind spots and the people around us know us better than ourselves. But for much research, we simply ask people a series of questions, sometimes one question or a handful of questions about each of these dimensions. So in my research, I'm often having people self-report on a handful of questions. They don't know that I'm measuring agreeableness. They just know I'm asking questions about what they're like as a person. And there are reasons to be a little skeptical about that, take it with a grain of salt, but we find that it's very predictive of certain things. And in this case, it's people's self-reported agreeableness is really predictive of all kinds of things. And the same thing with trust. We take people's own self-reported views on trust. Again, you should take that with a grain of salt, but it turns out to predict a lot of things.
And there's like some more recent research that is looking into not asking people directly, but essentially observing their behavior, right? So some of the work that I've been doing is trying to see, can we predict the big five by looking at what people do online, right? Like whatever they post on Facebook, what they buy with their credit cards and so on and so forth. So it's like a somewhat more subtle way of trying to see, like, how do people's behaviors actually reflect how they see themselves in psychological terms. Like one of the questions that I saw in the chat, which I think is really important, like asking about who are those mood path people, right? Like how representative are they of the general population? What else do you know about them? So to some extent, I think this is like a really, really good point. So we know that people who are self-tracking, for example, most of the time, like if you're self-tracking your mood, if you're self-tracking your depression, you probably have a higher likelihood of actually suffering from some kind of mental health issues, because that's most likely the reason why you get into this in the first place. And this is also why and I think this has been changing over the last couple of years. So there's like this huge movement of self-tracking, of quantified self, like people just getting more interested in their daily experiences more generally. And this is what you see in this growing trend, kind of going down from 2019 to 2020. I think in the beginning, it was like an app that was built for people who have some kind of mental health issues. And over time, as the user base grew, you could see, okay, now it's like everybody is self-tracking their mood. And unfortunately, we don't have that much data on like any data on social demographics and their background, just for privacy reasons, right? So it's like highly sensitive data. And we don't necessarily want to have all this additional information, but also means that we can't answer questions like, how does it differ between like men and women? How does it differ like people of different socioeconomic backgrounds? But I think it's an important question to answer.
Sandra, I'm curious, like, when you look at the trends in the data, sort of even pre-pandemic, what's ahead? Like, are we heading into a fall, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, a latter part of the year where, regardless of the pandemic, mood was about to go down, and now we also have the pandemic, and it's also possible that there will be a second wave, that the pandemic will get worse. Do you kind of extrapolate anything about the trends?
I think this is one of the most interesting findings, to be honest. And it's not my own research, but I think it's just fascinating. So just mental health and well-being has been pretty constant for a long period of time, right? So life satisfaction, positive, negative affect has essentially been flat for decades. And the one moment that this changed is the introduction of smartphones. And I think it's fascinating because I think what is related to it is sleep. So we know that sleep is one of the biggest predictors of mental health, physical health, and well-being. And what seems to happen is that, like, the first thing, right, like we go to sleep and then maybe we still check our emails and we kind of send this quick message. Sometimes I catch myself waking up at night and be like, oh, I'm just quickly going to check, like, what's new. And then I can't fall back asleep. Or like the first thing in the morning I do is like check my phone. So it's really interesting to see that, like, pandemic aside, like those life events happen, right? But overall, I think this idea that we're constantly on and we find it incredibly difficult to switch off seems to be one of the biggest detrimental factors that is challenging mental health right now.
Interesting. And so you mentioned the advent of the cell phone. So I have to ask another sort of, signature moment of our era is social media. Is there any, I get that sort of like interfering with sleep and sort of the kind of almost addiction to interacting with a mobile device. What about the advent of social media, which came a little after the advent of these devices? Have you seen any connection there?
I mean, there's a lot of contradicting evidence in this. So in the beginning, I think there was like all this evidence saying that it's kind of to some extent making us more anxious, we're more self-conscious, like our identity is out there, right, for everybody to criticize. And we all know about like Twitter outrage and moral outrage. So hopefully none of you guys have been a victim of this. But there was like initial evidence that it's actually detrimental to our health and well-being. Now the picture seems to be a lot more nuanced. So the idea that it really depends on how you're using it. So if you're just using it to kind of project to the outside world how amazing you are, and you constantly compare yourself to the lives of others who seem to have amazing lives because everybody's eating extremely healthily on holidays all the time, and they have like the most amazing friends that support them. So if that's the only thing you do and you're using it really passively and you're just comparing yourself to others, that seems to be still pretty detrimental. If you're using it more actively to keep in touch with people and to share potentially some of your experiences, and you do that in an authentic way, so that's some of the work that I've been doing recently, is if you manage to use it as almost as an extension of your offline life, then that actually seems to be related to positive well-being. So it really heavily depends on how you use it.
That's great. It makes me think of two final points I'll make. Yes. Just kind of I've seen some of the data, and I don't want to just bash on social media, so I got a kind of a good side and a bad side. One is the bad is we've seen people who report being intensive social media users. Not only do they have lower levels of trust, and so we talked about that before, which might be a cause and a consequence of that, they're far more likely to endorse conspiracy theories around our current moment, including that the coronavirus was created in a lab for the express purpose of infecting everyone. And ironically enough, that it's spread by 5G. And I guess it's hard to have social media without 5G, so it's sort of, but people believe that 5G is a problem, is a source or a cause of COVID. But the other side, I guess a good thing I'll call it, is we've seen evidence in our data of people feeling social support, having a big effect on their well-being, and an effect and a reduction in their bad conflict, right? So they're better able to handle conflict, they're feeling more well-being. So when people are feeling connected and supported, and social media can play a positive role in that as well. So I'm looking at the clock and I'm realizing we have gone through the time that we promised for today's event. Sandra, is there anything else that you want to say by way of closing?
I think we could go on this on like this forever. So I think it was like a nice ending.
So we'll sign up. We'll probably just keep talking about our research.
Yes,
We'll be here all day. But for those of you who joined us for this Leading Through Crisis series, part of Columbia Business School, thank you very much for being here. I hope that you found this interesting. Feel free to reach out and get in touch with us if you have additional thoughts or questions. Thank you for being with us today, and we hope we'll see you maybe online again sometime in the future. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.